So he's going to address the Gentiles directly. And some of the things that we get lost in when we look at chapters 9, 10, and 11, we look at those through the eyes of the church. What we think of, what we believe to be New Testament Christianity. Now that's okay in the sense that, yes, that's what we're talking about. But what Paul is actually dealing with is, what about the Jews? That's a very important question. And we need to deal with that particular question. Just kind of a few preliminary remarks here. What about the Jews? The Jews primarily have rejected Jesus as being Messiah. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. Because we don't really understand as Gentiles, and especially Western Gentiles, how a Jewish person in Jerusalem or in Israel, how they really think. When we went there in 2017 on that trip, and we hit all the sites we could, our guide and the guides in Israel, they are very knowledgeable about New Testament Christianity. Very knowledgeable. As a matter of fact, they probably know the New Testament better than most Christians do. They can tell you, they take you to the site. Well, at this particular place, Jesus did this. Case in point, we go to Capernaum, or Capernaum, however you want to pronounce it. We go there, and there is the remains of the synagogue. Now, the synagogue that we're looking at, the bits and pieces of it is still there. Some of the columns that are still there, some of the stones are still there. That was a synagogue that was built later than the time of Jesus. But you can see the foundation of the synagogue that was there, that Jesus actually was in. And they tell you all those things. And they say they'll show you when you're there at the ruins of the synagogue there in Capernaum. They'll point across there, and there's a building on top of or over a site, and they say that's St. Peter's house, and it's close. It's really unique when you begin seeing just the proximity of things. So it's close. So Jesus leaves the synagogue, and he goes right to Peter's house, and it's not a very long walk at all. I mean, it's really close. And and they tell you about that. And when we're down by the Dead Sea, he tells us all about John. He wasn't baptizing here, but he was baptizing there, John the Baptist. And just a whole host of things like that. And it was interesting because when we crossed the Sea of Galilee with the guy that we were on his boat, he was a Messianic Jew, meaning that he was a Jew that believed that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And of course he had CDs to sell because he would sing songs for us as we got in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. He'd sing, and whatnot. And of course he'd tell us that he had those available for sale. He's making a living. Don't fault him for that. But you can notice that our guide, he just kind of sat back, folded his arms, not really that interested in what this guy was saying. I mean, they're both Jewish, but they don't look at each other the same. And Tara asked our guide. We were walking somewhere, and Tara mentioned to him, his name was Moshe. Moshe means Moses. Moshe, you know so much about Jesus. Why don't you believe in Jesus? I don't think it was the first time he had been asked that question. He said, "Oh, I do believe in Jesus. I just don't believe he's the Messiah." He believed I believe in the miracles. I believe in all this. I believe it really happened. And he said something to me that was quite interesting. And this is where it gets kind of it didn't really resonate with me till I heard him say it. He said, when a Jew becomes a Christian, he's a Christian. He's no longer a Jew. So then it finally dawned on me why it was difficult for so many Jewish people to take the step of becoming a Christian, because in their minds, when they become a Christian, they are no longer Jewish. So you can see, I think, an issue there. At least it's their mindset. That's their mindset, at least what it seemed to be their mindset. Now, I just tell you that because the Jews, basically, not exclusively, not totally, but the Jews have rejected Jesus as being Messiah. That took place in the first century and is still very much so today. Benjamin Netanyahu is not a Christian. All right? His cabinet, probably the majority of those folks are not Christians. They're just not. They're Jews. That's how they view it. Now, having said that, so the question that was mentioned, as Paul has been dealing with, is still a question that you and I need to deal with. What about the Jews? Well, there's several ways of approaching this. But primarily, let me kind of paint with a broad brush and come down to two. There are two basic perspectives among Christians. Now, there are all kinds of subcategories here and that kind of thing, so that's why I'm talking about in broad terms. There are those that believe, they usually, and we'll talk about last days things, they focus in on things like, they're what's called amillennial. An A or before a word in Greek negates the word. If you are a theist, you believe in God. If you're an atheist, you believe no God. Okay? God, are you with me there? All right, very good. That's kind of the way that works. Well, back to our text here. Paul is really dealing with the question, so what? What about the Jews now? And that's what we're going to be unpacking. Now, that one thing is, that the church, I didn't finish my thought there, the church, Christianity, generally speaking, has now replaced, the church today is the vehicle through whom God is working. Israel has they're out of the picture. And that's why you'll have certain Christian groups, churches, denominations that want to defund Israel. They may shout for Palestine, and you seem somewhat confused. Why are you? They just believe that God is done with the Jewish nation, so thereby the church now is what God is working through. That's one group. The other group, or another perspective, better than saying the word group, but the other perspective is, no, God's promises to Israel, He is still bound by those promises to Israel. He is not through with Israel at this point in history. As a matter of fact, God has lots more in store for Israel in the future. And the church itself is different than Israel. Now, what I mean by now, the church today, God is actively working through, and it's composed of both Jews, and basically the vast majority are going to be Gentiles. Okay? But the two are not, we're talking about Israel and the church, they're not the same thing. Alright? Now you'll see that in just a few more minutes. Now I'm going to jump ahead to have you look at a verse that's going to be incredibly important in our understanding this. Okay? And it is verse 29 of chapter 11. If you mark your Bibles, I would recommend you mark this verse. If you don't mark your Bibles, to kind of give you right down where you can look it up later and be aware where it is. It basically reads this way: For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. That verse alone destroys replacement theology. It just does. Because replacement theology cannot withstand that statement. And Paul's going to emphasize it. He's already emphasized it several times in the book of Romans. He's going to do it some more too. But the calling and the gifts of God are irrevocable. Okay, I want to take you to two covenants that God has made. The first one is to the Abrahamic covenant. The covenant he made with Abraham. Well, he began when he called Abraham in Ur of the Chaldeans. He told him in verse 3 of chapter 12 of Genesis, I will bless those that bless you, I will curse those who curse you, and through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay. Then in chapter 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham. This covenant is incredibly important because this covenant is transferred to Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's descendants. And it is the covenant that God has made with the descendants, the children of Israel, that is even to this day. What is that covenant? Well, the covenant is Abraham was instructed to get certain animals. And the larger animals, he was to cut them in half, separate them. Okay, the halves. This is called, in the Old Testament, this was called cutting a covenant. You separate those animals, and in things like birds or smaller, you were to just put them on the side. You didn't have to cut them in half. And what the idea, the practice of the ancient world was, when two people were entering into a relationship, an agreement, or more strongly expressed, a covenant. When that takes place, okay, both parties in the ceremony walk between the halves of the animals. And what it signifies is, if I do not keep my part of the covenant, may what happens to these animals happen to me. So it was a very serious thing. Very serious. It was cutting a covenant in blood. No doubt about it. Well, Abraham waited and waited and waited, and God was waiting for God to show up. And God hadn't manifested himself yet. Abraham falls asleep. He has a vision that his descendants are going to be in captivity for 400 years. So he's looking forward to that time. And then God, he incidentally tells Abraham something and says it's going to this 400-year period of history is purposeful in God's plan because the fullness of the sin of the Amorite has not yet come in. Talking about God gave a reprieve to the people groups living in Canaan 400 more years. Now, by Abraham, it was even a lot longer than that. And then the conquest would take place. Okay, now we said that. Well, God does come. Depending on the translation, how it's rendered in your translation, either a flaming torch or a burning oven passes between the halves, the animals. And the point is, only God passes through. Abraham does not. Meaning that God had bound himself that he would keep his covenant with Abraham. And Abraham did not pass through, so he was not bound with the same kind of intensity to keep his part of the covenant. Do you follow me there? Well, let me go down a little bit more history. Let's go to Mount Sinai. Children of Israel are coming out of Egypt. Now they're out into the desert. And by the way, Mount Sinai is not in the Sinai Peninsula. It's in Saudi Arabia. That's where it is. As a matter of fact, if you ask Bedouins, as I understand it, in that general area, they will tell you that's the mountain of Moses. It's got a fence around it to keep archaeologists out of it. And the Saudi government has done that. So you're not supposed to go up there. Anyway, besides that. So on Mount Sinai, something takes place. God issues a kind of an expansion, clarification of the covenant. And then we call that covenant the Ten Commandments. God tells his people what he expects from them. And they ratify it. They agree to it. These 10 words, the Decalogue. As a matter of fact, it becomes known as the law. And it's inside the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? And then we got that covenant. And we're still talking about the same covenant. Now there is a little bit of a covenant that God makes with David. And the covenant God makes with David, or the promise to David is, upon your throne you will have a descendant who will reign forever. We know that to be a son of David who was to be the Messiah, Jesus himself. So all three of those are very important, especially the ones that God made with the people of Israel. Now, did the people of Israel keep their end or keep their part of the covenant? They repeatedly, generation after generation, they violated the covenant. Nevertheless, God promised them, He made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God committed Himself to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I know I'm doing a lot, and we're not even into the text yet. Now, I want us to do something else. So this is a clarification process. Is there a difference between the state or the nation of Israel and the Israel that God has made a covenant with? And a good answer is yes and no. Okay? Yes, they are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not simply the descendants of Abraham, but also of Isaac and Jacob, Jacob's 12 sons, etc. Now, but the state of Israel, or the nation of Israel, they're occupying the land, or at least a portion of the land that God had given to them. So, yes, they are descendants there, but that doesn't mean that they, like Paul said last time, not all of Israel is Israel. What we're talking about and what we find is there is a remnant. Paul's going to talk about that. A remnant is not the entirety of the population, but a segment of the population. And that segment of the population are those that do believe. The others that don't believe, they may be descendants of Abraham, but they're not children of the promise. Are you following? Okay. All right. I think that's probably belabored enough. And so we'll begin right with verse 1. I say then, has God rejected His people? That is a very valid question. That's a question we began with just a few moments ago, or at least a semblance of it. Has God rejected His people? Well, it looks like it. They've certainly rejected the Messiah, right? So if they've rejected the Messiah, surely then that means that, well, is God done? Is now the focus going to be on the church, Gentiles? Is that where the focus is? Well, Paul follows up by saying, may it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so has God rejected His people? And Paul is saying, wait a minute, call me as a witness. I am a descendant of Abraham, I am from the tribe of Benjamin, and I follow the Messiah. So no, the first witness he calls is himself. No, God has not rejected His people. He goes on. Verse 2, God has not rejected His people whom He foreknew. Or do you not know what the Scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel. Now, do you remember the circumstances there as the event unfolds there? You remember Mount Carmel? 400 prophets, 450 prophets. Actually, it ends up being 850 prophets. The prophets of Baal are trying to call Baal down, power to burn the sacrifice there. And Baal doesn't do anything. So then Elijah, very courageously, he's the sole prophet. So he builds his altar, he puts the wood on it, he puts the sacrifice on it, and then he has them carry water. Get it good and wet. And he got it good and wet. And then God answers by fire. He comes down, He burns the sacrifice, He burns the wood, He burns the stones, He burns up and evaporates the water. Pretty impressive. Then the 450 prophets of Baal, well, they don't fare so well. They're executed. And Elijah leads in that effort there. And then he receives word, not from 400 prophets, but from one woman. Just one. Her name is Jezebel. Jezebel tells or sends word to Elijah, by this time tomorrow, you're going to be just like one of them. So he runs. He runs. And he probably ends up, of all places, he probably ends up at Mount Sinai. That's just my guess, but I think that's where he ends up. And God, there's the wind, and God is not in the wind. There's the wind and the fire, and God is not in those things. And comes to him, the old way is a still small voice. Actually, it's a whisper. Elijah, what are you doing here? And then he gets into the kind of the pity party part. Lord, I've served you faithfully. I'm the only one left, and they're after me. God, and then the Lord says something to him. He says, I have 7,000 men who have not bent a knee or bowed a knee to Baal. You're not the only one. That is a remnant. Majority of the people have been following the false gods, but there's 7,000 who have not. That's important to keep that in mind, because that's what he's pointing to here. Then in verse 4, but what does the divine response say to him? I have left for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In this way, then, at the present time, a remnant, according to God's gracious choice, has also come to be. But if it is by grace, it is no longer by works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. But the chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. And David said, let their table become a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block, and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and bend their backs forever. Okay. He's talking about a remnant. He's quoting from the Old Testament to support his contention. And he speaks about them being hardened. Now, what does that mean? Now, again, we have to deal with this because sometimes we have our presuppositions. We already got it tucked away what we think it means. Remember last time, was it last time we looked at Pharaoh for a little bit? Or was it time before last? Time before last. Well, you find that the first 7 times that the hardening of a heart mentioned of Pharaoh hardens his heart. Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then it comes to a place, now God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And some of his leadership as well. So here we have the idea of being hardened again. Now it's important that we remember something that we're going to see in a few moments. Why was their hearts hardened? Did God say, okay, I'm going to keep this number of people who believe in me, and this will be my remnant that I will protect, I will keep, and all the others I will harden? Be careful. Be careful with that, because we're going to discover in a few minutes it was because of their unbelief that they were hardened. Now, so I say that because unbelief and being hardened they go hand in hand. Even those people that God hardened is based on their unbelief. So, so in other words, we as human beings, we have a part in this. Well, let's go a little bit further, and I'll show you. Paul says again, verse 11, I say then. That's how he started, really. I say then. He does it again. Did they stumble so as to fall? Well, may it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentile, how much more will their fullness be? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. See, there's where he points it out. I'm speaking to Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. If somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. Okay? Now, not to veer off in some very deep theological waters, but kind of just speaking kind of on more of a surface level. Paul is acknowledging that all Jews are not going to believe in Jesus as Messiah. It's not. And that unbelief and being hardened go hand in hand. They do not believe. Their hearts are hardened. And it's hard for you and I to understand this, but because we believe. It makes sense, doesn't it? Doesn't it make sense to believe? I mean, really. You go along with me here so I can keep going, okay? I want to make sure we're on the same page. It makes sense to us. It makes perfect sense. But to some people, it doesn't make sense. And there could be a lot of factors that are reason for that. And because of that, they refuse to believe. Now, I will tell you this, and this is, I'm kind of painting with a broad brush again, so there will be anomalies or there will be exceptions to the rule, that kind of thing. But if you deal with atheists, you find primarily there's two kinds. All right? The smaller of the group will be those that have intellectual difficulty. To them, evolution makes sense, and millions and billions of years make sense, and they look at life from that perspective, and they don't see in their minds nothing in creation or in people or in an argument that convinces them otherwise. They're pretty well got their mind made up. That's a smaller group. Really, I guess I should say there's three types. The next type of atheists are those that it's not that they don't believe in God, it's that they don't want to believe in God. Because if there is someone at the end of life that's going to hold them accountable for what they've done, they don't like that idea at all. So you will find that many of those atheists, they will fall into that kind of category. And some of them will be honest about it. Hey, it'll mess up my life if God exists. If I can't make my own decisions and can't do what I want to do and all that kind of thing, they know that their life is out of keeping with what biblical morality for sure. They know that. But that's one of the reasons, that's one of the motivations for them to do that. And maybe the other group, I told you there's two, I think I can divide it into three without fear of too much contradiction. The final group is the emotional atheist. It's not that he has good reasons. He said he's had a terrible dad. It's amazing about some of the atheists that you can read their stuff, and if you find out anything about their lives, you find that they either had an absent dad or a very poor relationship with their father. And they transfer that to God. Back when Richard Dawkins wrote his book, The God Delusion, and it was being reviewed, it was obvious that Dawkins was outside of his lane. Biology, that's his lane. Philosophy is not his lane, because he made some very poor statements. for example, is this, he even tried to use this syllogism, something to this effect, I don't remember. Well, that's a mixture of categories. That a first-year philosophy student would not make that mistake. But here, Dawkins did. But anyway, it was, I think Alvin Plantinga was writing a review of that book, The God Delusion. And a couple of things that he said, and he's a Christian apologist, philosopher, Alvin Plantinga was. Pretty good one for the most part. Anyway, but he made this observation. One, to call Dawkins' book, sophomoric, is an insult to sophomores. You know what sophomore means? Sophisticated moron. That's what it means. So it would be an insult to sophomores. But he also said this, that he believes, this is tongue-in-cheek, of course, that probably just before Richard Dawkins was born, his mother was frightened by an Anglican priest. Which is kind of, that's what he said there. So you have those kind. Now when you think about it, when you listen to some of those people who profess to be atheists and listen to their arguments and think about what they're saying, you realize they are hardening their hearts. They're really grasping at straws. And some of the things are quite silly. But anyway, you'll discover that. So we can do that. We can harden our hearts. Paul is making a turn here, and he's talking to the Gentiles, and he's talking about that there has been this partial hardening. He's mentioned that before. He's going to come back to it for the benefit of the Gentiles. That in turn, when God begins working among the Gentiles, that will make the Jewish people jealous. Because God now is at work not with the chosen people, but now with the Gentile world. And you can kind of see that just a little bit. I'm going to give you a kind of an example of how that jealousy works. I've got two grandsons, and we had them together. Elias, he's got to be in a good mood, before he'll be around you much or sit on your lap or anything like that. It's part of his personality. Well, Joshua, conversely to that, and he climbs all over you. So we were out in the backyard, and Joshua comes kind of close, and Elias is right there. And Joshua comes, and he climbs up on my lap. Elias looked at that, and he came right over and climbed up on my lap. Now, he didn't know why he did that, but he did that because Joshua was on my lap. So it's a very simplistic way of illustrating that that's what's going on. And God is working on His timetable, not ours. But the Gentile world coming to Christ, following a Jewish Messiah, my boss is a Jewish carpenter kind of thing, it will make them jealous. And there will be that drawing to Him as Messiah according to God's time scale. Let's go a bit further now. And then he goes on in verse 15. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So if we are benefiting because of the Jewish rejection of Messiah, if we're being blessed by that, can you imagine how much better it's going to be when the Jews embrace Jesus as Messiah? That's his point. He goes on? And he says, and if the first piece of dough is holy, then the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. Now he's going to get it. Now, again, you're going to see here why replacement theology misses the point. That the church has replaced Israel in God's redemptive plan. This will help you see that because Paul is going to use pictures for us. Illustrations. And he begins by saying, Okay, if you make and ladies, you'll understand this a lot better than the men will. When you take a lump of dough and you've got yeast in it, the yeast is in the whole thing, right? So if the whole thing is holy, every part of it is. He said, well, wait a minute. If the root is holy, so are the branches that get their nourishment and their substance from the root, right? Not a trick question. I mean, just, yeah. Now he's going to talk about that, and he's going to expand it a little bit. Verse 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became a partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree. So he's using something a little bit different. Now you wouldn't do this normally. If you've got a cultivated olive tree, you don't go out and break the limbs off of that tree and find a wild tree out there and get the limbs and graft them in. That's kind of the opposite of what you'd want to do. But the point is, it's okay. They've rejected Messiah. They've been broken off because of that. And what God has done, He's taken now Gentiles, the wild olive branches, and He's grafted them in to the cultivated tree. So you see, we have now a part. It doesn't mean that we are the new Israel. What it means, though, is that we are partakers in the promises because of the rejection of Messiah according to by the Jews. Now, he's going to continue developing that. You then, branches, well, let's go back up verse 18. Do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast against them, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. Now that's important. There are some Christian groups that have very little need or concern about the Old Testament. They just don't care. They don't study it. They don't read from it. They don't understand the importance or significance of it. Sometimes Christians are that way too. Is the Old Testament important to us? Why? How so?
It fulfills promises of the.
Because the promises God made are fulfilled, made in the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New. Good, yeah. Actually, though, one of the things you need to see. Now, I haven't done this very much at all in my life. I saw it on TV more than I've actually seen it in real life. But I have seen when you go to a jewelry store or a store that sells jewelry. Sometimes when you want to look at this particular ring and they'll bring it out and what is it on? Black velvet. Why? Because that black velvet is a good background to show you and reflect what you're looking at. And they might even have a black cloth or something. They'll bring it out and lay it on it, and that way they have the lights just right, so you can look at that and say, "Man, look at that thing glisten." Okay, but that background makes it stand out a lot more vividly, right? Well, in one sense, the Old Testament's like that. If you've got a good grasp of the Old Testament, the New Testament makes a lot more sense. Because the New Testament is written with the Old Testament in view. Matter of fact, what was the early church, say the church, within 10 years of, after the day of Pentecost, I'll say it that way. What Bible did they have? The Old Testament. The New Testament had not been written yet. They had the Old Testament. So when Paul talks about the Scripture is God-breathed or inspired, what's he talking about? The Old Testament. Because the New Testament has yet to be written. So it's important to remember that. And a lot, for example, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, now when I say an allusion, I'm not talking about a direct quotation, but a close enough statement that it does have an Old Testament backing. Which New Testament book do you think has the most Old Testament allusions in it?
Romans.
No. Good guess. Good guess. Revelation. Revelation. I mean, let me tell you. Okay, I'm gonna help you understand this, and you'll see what I mean. And I could use a lot of different examples. I'm just going to use one for sake of time. Jesus and his disciples have been ministering on the other side. And Jesus dismisses the 4,000 that he's fed, along with their families. Tells his disciples to get into a boat and to go to the other side. They start doing that, and he stays behind to pray. But as he's praying, he can see them, and it's a contrary wind. It's storming a little bit, and they're doing all they can do. But the wind is strong enough they can't make any progress. I mean, they're paddling with all their might, and they're not going anywhere because of the strength of the storm, the wind, the waves. Then they look, and they see a figure coming toward them, walking on the water. Okay, you with me? You remember the account? And Jesus walks up, and he is walking. He's going to walk right on by them and keep on going. And of course they're scared. I mean, if you're in the middle of a lake and you see somebody come walking, are you kind of spooked? Well, yeah, you can understand their sentiment. You can understand that. Okay, here he comes walking, and then I'm going to skip the part about Peter sinking and all that stuff. He gets into the boat, and they're amazed. And they say this question, who is this? Now, hang with me for a moment. Well, they've seen a lot. They've seen Jesus heal all kinds of diseases, paralysis, all kinds of things. They've seen all this. They've seen him feed the 5,000 and plus the others, probably over 20,000 people. They see him the 4,000 and all the people related there. They've seen that. They've heard him talk. They haven't seen him raise a dead person. But it's when he walks on the water that now they're really freaking out. Why? Book of Job says that God comes walking on the sea. So when they see Jesus walking on the sea, why do they say, who can this be? Because they know that this is an indication that Jesus is not just a miracle-working prophet. Because in Job says that God comes walking on the waves of the sea, and there's Jesus. He's doing it. Yes?
What chapter and what verse in Job?
I don't remember off the top of my head. It's right around chapter 14. But I'm not saying that's the exact thing, exact reference. But it's right in there somewhere. That God comes walking on the sea. You don't know that unless you know the Old Testament. There's a lot of things you don't know too. You don't know. There's the issue of Abraham offering Isaac, and the wording there, where God tells him, "Take your son, your only son, the son that you love, and offer him as a sacrifice on a hill that I will show you." Well, he shows him the hill, and then later, that's the vicinity that Jesus is sacrificed. And you hear John 3:16 in that verse, in Genesis. Take your son, your only son, the son whom you love, and offer him as a sacrifice. So you have all kinds of that. You have even here, if you have a Bible that sets apart the quotations from the Old Testament, we've got so far, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 so far, and we're not done yet. Okay, let's go a little bit further, and then we'll find a parking place. And so you then, the branches were broken off so that you might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their benefit, but you stand by your faith. Do not be haughty. Don't be proud. Don't be arrogant. Don't do that. And he goes on and he points out And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. So there's a future promise there that the limbs that have been broken off are going to be regrafted in. What prevents that from happening is what? Unbelief. Unbelief. Does it matter what you believe?
Yes.
You know, it does. It does. It makes all the difference what you believe. Okay. Go a little bit further while we still have a little bit of time. Verse 24. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? In other words, he's just saying it again another way. It's going to be really blessed. If we're blessed because of Israel's rejection of Messiah, can you imagine the blessing that's going to come because there will come a time when they will embrace Jesus as Messiah? Now, Paul is talking future. And what he's referring to is still future. There are, I have no idea how to estimate this, but there's a lot of, probably thousands, of Messianic Jews in this world. Jews that worship Jesus as the Messiah, as the Lord, as the King. There are churches in Israel, in the nation of Israel, that is composed of both Palestinian believers and Jewish believers, which is an amazing thing. You want to get Jews and Palestinians to get along? Get them in church. Get them saved in church. I should be more careful in my wording. Well, and you can find other places. Have any of you ever heard of Jonathan Cahn? I mean, how could you not? I mean, all the books that he has written and all that and whatnot. He's a Jew. He's Jewish. But he is a Jew that believes Jesus is the Messiah. So he's a Messianic Jew. I don't know if you remember a young man that we had, he's from Tel Aviv some years ago. It's right around Easter. He came and talked about the Passover meal. A young Jewish man with a group called Jews for Jesus. He lived in Tel Aviv. I've given you this before, but if you want to, go to YouTube, type in "So be it." So be it. And what you find is you'll find there some Jewish men, and there's some gals too, but mainly Jewish men that talk to Jewish people on the streets of Jerusalem or on Tel Aviv or somewhere there, and they will talk to them about Jesus. Now, the most surprising thing is how little Jewish people actually know about Jesus. I mean, it's amazing. You would think they would know more, but they don't. It's stunning what they don't know. Even guys with the big, long white beards and and the curlies and the big black hat, how little that they know about actually Jesus, because it's always been forbidden of them to actually learn more about who he was. And one of the most creative things that they do is they are talking to them, and they will sometimes they'll be speaking not English but Hebrew. They go back and forth sometimes. So usually they'll have the words there so you understand what they're saying. And they will read to them, where do you think this comes from? The Old Testament or the New Testament? And of course, they use sometimes the Jewish designation for those two covenants. And they'll read Isaiah 53. I say, well, that sounds like Jesus. Where's that? I think they'll say New Testament. And they're absolutely stunned to find out it's from Isaiah. It's the forbidden chapter. They're stunned by it. Because they will say out of their own mouth, that sounds like it's talking about Jesus. They know he was crucified. They may not know a whole lot else, but they do recognize those kind of imagery. Okay? So we're going to park there. We're going to stop there because he changes in verse 25 through the balance of the chapter. There's where he's going to be talking about all Israel being saved. We're going to talk about what it means all Israel will be saved. It does not mean all Jews will be saved. Don't think of it in those terms, because that's not the way it is to be understood. Now, you do have time without staying to 7:30 to ask a question or a comment or offer an insight or whatever you would like. You get the opportunity to do that.
You've seen the picture online where it's a line from the Old Testament to the New and all the connections that are made.
I haven't seen that particular imagery or image, but yeah, there's at least 300 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament fulfilled in the New. Sometimes you can get those charts, the citing where it is in the Old Testament and where it is fulfilled in the New. But it's clear that that's where they're quoting. And matter of fact, that's how you get a Jewish audience to engage when you're quoting from the Old Testament, because they're familiar with the Old Testament to some degree, especially those that are practicing. And for example, when you read a sermon of Paul, it's important to know to whom he's speaking. This is a good thing for you to be aware of, especially when you talk to people who may have absolutely or very little knowledge of anything biblical. Be aware of that. You'll get a lot further. You don't start talking to them, well, let's someone talk about the dichotomy or the trichotomy of man. That's probably not a good starting point with someone who doesn't even know fully that Jesus is revealed in Scripture as being God. That's probably not a good place to begin. And I'll give you an example of this. When Paul is talking to Jews, he has a lot of Old Testament quotations. He ties it to the Old Testament. When he's talking to Greeks, he doesn't use the Old Testament. Case in point, the Areopagus, Mars Hill. When Paul deals there, and when he gets his opportunity to speak to the eggheads that are there, he does not begin, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was without form and void. And, he doesn't start there. He says, I notice that you all, he's from southern, anyway, I notice that you are a very religious group. As I've been walking through your city in Athens, of course, when I walk through the city, I see this altar to all these different gods, and there's one there that says to the unknown God. I want to talk to you about that God. You don't know him, but I want to introduce you to him. And he begins talking from that perspective. And then he begins talking about Jesus being raised from the dead. He tells a story of what that means, and the significance of it. And as he's preaching that message, speaking to Greeks that know nothing or very little, if anything, about the Old Testament, probably nothing. There's people who believe, not very many, but there are some. There are some that do. These Greek philosophers get confused. Because, see, they're coming from their mindset and their frame of reference. They're coming from their worldview, how they view reality. So, Jesus, they understand that Jesus, Paul's preaching that Jesus is God, and the resurrection, they assume that is the consort of God. Because they come from a mindset of gods and goddesses. So then they think, well, there's Jesus God, and then his consort is resurrection. They don't understand. And that's okay. Now they're thinking about something and whatnot. So you understand the importance of doing that. I had a very brilliant professor. Brilliant. I've talked to him about him before. He was a church history professor. Your grade rested on one test. One test. And he was precise. The medium and the mean were deadlocked. I mean, it was like scientific precision. And he was just brilliant guy. And it was. I heard tales about him. He's the only church history professor, so you've got to take the 3 church history classes from him. There's no other option. And it was just amazing. I heard tales that, Womble, if the bell rings, he stops lecturing until the next time the class meets. He starts lecturing mid-sentence, right where he left off. We all thought he had a photographic memory. And there was a student that I think took a tape recorder and recorded the lectures of Womble, went back to his room or her room, I don't remember if it was a man or woman, and typed them up. And you could buy the notes for his class. I did. Because everything rides on one grade. Anyway, I never heard Dr. Womble speak outside of a seminary environment, but I knew someone that did, and said, you would be amazed. I went to a church, some sort of place, and Dr. Womble was preaching. And as he was preaching, he never used big words. He had a very, very easily to understand message. That's really good. He just knew his audience. Now, a group full of students, he used the big words, but there he didn't. Okay, we'll pick up at verse 25 next time.